If that dog bites me, I swear I'm calling my lawyer and suing this entire shelter." The words tumbled out of my mouth before I could stop them, sharp and defensive, spoken mostly to convince myself I had any control over the situation. I stood frozen in front of Kennel 12, my heart doing that uncomfortable thing where it beats too fast and too slow at the same time. I hadn't meant to say it out loud, but the exhaustion of the past 2 years, the grief that sat like a stone in my chest, and the fear of opening my heart again had combined into that one ugly sentence. A woman passing by with a mop bucket stopped mid-stride. She looked me up and down with one eyebrow raised in the way only shelter workers can, a look that says they've seen every kind of human excuse and decided none of them matter much. "He won't bite," she said flatly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd said this 1,000 times before. "He's just different." Different. The word hung in the cold shelter air like a diagnosis, like a warning label, like a challenge I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. I'd volunteered at enough animal shelters over the years, back when I had the energy for it, back when I still believed I could make a difference, to know exactly what different meant in this context. It was code language. Shelter's shorthand for a dog who'd been here too long. A dog the staff had run out of cheerful euphemisms for. A dog that nobody wanted and nobody could quite figure out how to help. Different meant damaged, difficult, defective. Different meant alone. The dog sat perfectly still behind the chain-link door of Kennel 12, not barking, not pacing, not doing any of the desperate attention-seeking behaviors I'd seen from the other dogs in this wing. He just watched me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. His fur was a chaotic tangle of grays and tans, long and wild around his ears, patchy and thin along his sides like someone had started grooming him and given up halfway through the job. He looked like the result of some failed experiment to turn a dust mop into a wolf, all matted texture and no clear breed, no defining characteristics that would make someone stop and say, "Oh, what a beautiful dog." One eye was clouded over with the milky white of age or injury, rendering it functionally useless. But the other eye, the right one, sparkled with a bright, startling yellow that seemed almost supernatural in its intensity. There was something in that eye that I couldn't quite name. Not fear, which I would have expected. Not aggression, which I'd been warned about. Something else entirely. Curiosity, maybe. Or assessment. Like he was the one deciding whether I was worthy, not the other way around. I took a hesitant step closer to the kennel. The dog didn't growl, didn't cower, didn't react at all. Just kept watching me with that unblinking yellow eye, his head completely still, his body language impossible to read. "What's his name?" I asked the woman with the mop, my voice softer now, almost apologetic for my earlier outburst. She shrugged with the casual indifference of someone who'd learned not to get attached. "Tag just says Oliver. He came in wearing it when someone dropped him at the door in the middle of the night. No microchip, no veterinary records, no explanation. Just the tag and a whole lot of silence." Oliver. The name didn't suit him at all. It was too refined, too proper for this scraggly, mysterious creature who looked like he'd been assembled from the leftover parts of other dogs. But I wasn't here to rename shelter dogs. I wasn't even sure why I was here at all. I was here because my younger sister Emma had cornered me 3 weeks ago over coffee and told me, with the kind of gentle firmness only siblings can manage, that I was ready to adopt again. That 2 years was long enough to grieve. That Cooper, my golden retriever who'd been my constant companion through a decade of life's ups and downs, would have wanted me to open my heart again. Honestly, I hadn't thought I'd ever be able to fill the hole Cooper left behind. The house still felt wrong without the click of his nails on the hardwood floors, the weight of his head on my lap during movies, the enthusiastic greeting that awaited me no matter how terrible my day had been. But things change, people say. Time heals, they insist. You'll know when you're ready, they promise. Except I didn't feel ready. I felt terrified. I crouched down slowly, my knees protesting the movement. When did I get so old? And peered through the chain-link bars that separated us. The cold from the concrete floor seeped through my jeans. "Hey, Oliver," I said softly, trying to inject some warmth into my voice despite the chill that permeated everything in this place. Still nothing. Not even the slightest tail wag. Just that unwavering stare from that one good eye, golden and bright and somehow sad. "I'll give you a minute," the shelter worker said, her voice echoing down the hallway as she walked away with a mop and bucket, leaving me alone with this strange, silent creature. I stayed there, crouched like an idiot in front of Kennel 12, trying to get a feel for this dog who seemed determined to remain an enigma. He blinked slowly, deliberately, and then his head tilted just the slightest fraction of an inch to the left. That's when I saw it. The tag on his collar wasn't a standard shelter ID tag. It was old brass, worn smooth in places, round like an antique coin. Something was written on it, but the lighting in this dim hallway made it impossible to read from where I crouched. I leaned in closer, squinting at the engraved letters. The woman's voice called from somewhere down the hallway, distant and matter-of-fact. It's the only reason we haven't put him down yet. Put him down. The words hit me like a physical punch to the chest. My breath caught, and I felt my hands start to shake. This dog, this quiet, mysterious, different dog, was on death row. His days were numbered, counted down by budget constraints and kennel space, and the cruel mathematics of shelter life that said some animals were more adoptable than others. I grabbed my phone from my pocket with trembling fingers, turned on the flashlight, and aimed it through the bars at the brass tag hanging from Oliver's worn leather collar. The engraving was old, the letters shallow from years of wear, but still legible in the harsh lead light. Asterisk if you're reading this. I was loved once. Asterisk. I felt a lump rise in my throat so suddenly and so completely that I couldn't swallow. My eyes started to burn with tears I hadn't cried in months. This wasn't just a dog. This was someone's family member. Someone's best friend. Someone had loved this creature enough to have that message engraved on permanent metal, a testament to a bond that had existed before whatever tragedy or circumstance had landed Oliver here in this cold, lonely kennel. "Come on, Oliver," I said, my voice cracking with emotion I didn't know I still had capacity for. "Let's get you out of here." He didn't move, didn't react, just continued to sit there with that same inscrutable calm, as if he'd learned long ago that hope was a dangerous thing to hold on to. The shelter worker returned with a set of keys jangling from a carabiner on her belt. Her expression had softened slightly. Maybe she'd heard the change in my voice, or maybe she'd seen this moment happen enough times to recognize it. "You sure about this one?" she asked, genuine concern in her eyes. He's been here 7 months. Hasn't shown interest in anyone. Doesn't play, doesn't bark, barely eats. Most people walk right past him." "Yeah," I said, not taking my eyes off Oliver, unable to look away from that golden eye that seemed to see straight through every defense I'd built. "Here's the one." She nodded slowly, respect and relief mixing in her expression. "All right then." She opened the kennel door with practiced efficiency, the metal hinges groaning in protest. Oliver didn't lunge forward with desperate freedom-seeking energy like I'd seen other dogs do. He didn't bolt for the exit or cower in the back corner. Instead, he stood up slowly, his joints audibly creaking in a way that made my heart ache, and walked out like an old man who'd learned through hard experience that there was no point in hurrying. The world would wait, or it wouldn't. Either way, rushing changed nothing. The hallway fell suddenly, eerily silent. Even the other dogs, who'd been barking and whining just seconds before in their desperate bids for attention, went quiet. It was as if they recognized something in this moment, some significance that transcended the usual chaos of shelter life. Oliver stood beside me in that strange silence, just stood there like he was waiting for instructions, for permission, for some sign of what came next. I reached down tentatively, my hand hovering above his matted head for a long second while I gathered my courage. Then, very gently, I rested it on top of his skull, feeling the warmth of him, the solid reality of bone and muscle beneath all that tangled fur. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. And then I felt it, the softest, smallest tail wag brushing against my ankle like a whispered secret. Outside, the winter sun was too bright after the dim interior of the shelter, the kind of sharp, clear light that makes everything look both more beautiful and more harsh at the same time. I had to squint against it as I led Oliver to my truck in the parking lot. I opened the passenger door and gestured inside. "Up you go, buddy." He looked at the seat, then at me, then back at the seat. His expression, if a dog could be said to have an expression, seemed to say, "Asterisk, you want me up there? In the actual truck? Not in the back, asterisk." "You're not that heavy," I assured him, though truthfully I had no idea how much he weighed under all that matted fur. "And I've lifted heavier things." Oliver stepped up into the truck like he'd done it 100 times before, with a confidence that suggested this wasn't his first vehicle, wasn't his first adoption, wasn't his first attempt at a new life. He settled into the passenger seat, circled once to find the right position, then curled up as tightly as his old joints would allow. We drove home in silence except for the soft, steady sound of his breathing. I kept glancing over at him, this strange creature who'd somehow become mine in the span of 30 minutes, wondering what I'd just done, wondering if I was ready for this, wondering if he was. At the house, the same house where Cooper had lived and loved and eventually died, Oliver took one slow, methodical tour of the living room. He sniffed each corner with careful deliberation, investigated the couch and the bookshelf and the coffee table, his nose working overtime to catalog all the scents of this new environment. Then he stopped in front of Cooper's old bed. I'd kept it clean for 2 years, unable to throw it away but also unable to look at it without feeling that crushing weight of loss. It sat in the corner by the fireplace where Cooper had always preferred it, where the warmth was best and the view of both the front door and the kitchen was unobstructed. "You can have it," I said quietly, surprised by how much the words cost me. This felt like betrayal somehow, like I was replacing Cooper, but also like healing. I kept it clean. It's good. Oliver circled the bed once, twice, 3 times, some ancient canine ritual of claiming space and ensuring safety. Then he lowered himself down with a sigh that sounded like it carried the weight of years, of losses I couldn't begin to imagine, of a life lived and endured and somehow survived. I sat on the couch, completely unsure what came next. What do you do with a dog who doesn't bark or play or beg? How do you build a relationship with a creature who seems to exist in a world slightly removed from your own? But the room felt different with him in it. Warmer, somehow. Less empty. Like a held breath finally being released. That night, Oliver didn't bark, didn't whine, didn't pace or scratch or do any of the anxiety-driven behaviors I'd been warned new rescue dogs often exhibited. He just slept, his breathing steady and deep, like he'd finally found permission to rest. The next morning, I woke before my alarm with that disoriented feeling of having forgotten something important. Then I heard it, the soft sound of breathing that wasn't my own, the presence of another living being in my house for the first time in 2 years. Oliver. I found him still in Cooper's bed, though he'd shifted position during the night. He was awake when I came downstairs, watching me with that one good eye. But he didn't get up, didn't rush to greet me, just acknowledged my presence with the smallest tilt of his head. "Good morning," I said, feeling foolish talking to a dog who showed no indication he cared about my words. But I'd always talked to Cooper, had carried on one-sided conversations for a decade, and the habit felt important somehow. I made eggs for breakfast, scrambled, the way I always did on Saturday mornings. Oliver didn't beg, didn't even come into the kitchen. He just sat by the back door with perfect stillness, waiting without asking. "You're polite," I observed, setting down 2 plates, one for me, one with a small portion of eggs for him on the floor. "I'll give you that much." His ears twitched forward at the sound of the plate touching the floor, but he didn't move until I stepped back, giving him space and permission. He approached the food slowly, sniffed it thoroughly, then ate with careful deliberation, as if he'd learned that food was not guaranteed and should be treated with respect. The days that followed took on a strange rhythm, each one a little less quiet than the last, but not in the way I'd expected. Oliver didn't become loud or demanding. Instead, he began to follow me from room to room with quiet determination. He'd sit by the bathroom door while I showered, wait outside the garage while I pretended to organize tools I never used, walk beside me on his leash during our twice-daily trips around the block without ever pulling or tugging or showing interest in anything except maintaining his position exactly 3 feet to my left. A week after bringing him home, I decided he needed a proper bath. The shelter had done their best, but he still smelled like industrial cleaner and sadness, and his coat was impossibly matted in places. I filled the tub with warm water and lifted him in. He was heavier than he looked, solid muscle beneath the deceptive scruffiness. He stood completely still as I worked shampoo through his tangled fur, as I rinsed and repeated, as I carefully worked out the worst of the mats with conditioner and patience. The water that ran off him was gray-brown, carrying away months of neglect, and underneath all that grime and matting, I discovered a coat of rich golden brown streaked with white, like honey mixed with cream. He looked 10 pounds lighter when I finally lifted him out and wrapped him in a towel. His fur, properly clean and beginning to dry, showed the beginning of a handsome coat that must have been beautiful once. "Still not an Oliver," I muttered to myself, though I had no idea what else to call him. The name had stuck in that way names do, becoming identity through repetition rather than fit. I took him to the veterinarian the following Tuesday. Dr. Sarah Martinez had been Cooper's vet for his entire life, had been the one to help me make the impossible decision to let him go when the cancer became too much. I hadn't been back to her clinic since. She met us in the exam room with professional warmth, but I could see the concern in her eyes as she took in Oliver's appearance. "This is Oliver," I said unnecessarily, watching as Sarah knelt down to his level, her movements slow and non-threatening. She ran her experienced hands over his body, checking joints and teeth and lymph nodes, listening to his heart and lungs, looking in his ears and eyes. "He's old," she said finally, her voice gentle but honest. "Maybe 10 years, possibly older. Hard to say for sure without knowing his history. 10 years, an entire decade of life I knew nothing about. A decade that had brought him to Kennel 12, to that brass tag, to me. He's been through something," Sarah continued, her fingers carefully probing an old scar along his flank that I hadn't noticed before. "Multiple somethings, probably, but he's healthy. As healthy as any senior mixed breed could be, considering." Senior. The word settled over Oliver like a blanket. He wasn't a young dog with his whole life ahead of him. He was in the final chapters, the sunset years, the time when most people wanted puppies and energy, not quiet old souls who'd already seen too much. I started buying him soft chews and joint supplements, the expensive kind that promised to ease arthritis and improve mobility. I watched as, day by day, his steps grew a little quicker, his eyes a little brighter, the weight of age sitting a little lighter on his shoulders. But he still didn't bark. Not once. One night, about 3 weeks after bringing Oliver home, I dug through a box in the garage I'd been avoiding for 2 years. Cooper's things. Photos mostly, and a few note cards from neighbors who'd sent condolences when he passed. At the bottom, I found his favorite tennis ball, worn smooth from years of retrieval, the bright yellow faded to dainty cream. I rolled it across the living room floor without thinking, some muscle memory of games we used to play. Oliver watched it go, his good eye tracking its path across the hardwood. Then he looked at me, tilted his head in that way of his, walked over to the ball, and gently nudged it back in my direction. It was such a simple thing, such a small gesture, but it was the first time I'd laughed out loud in weeks. Real laughter, the kind that comes from your chest and surprises you with its force. Oliver's tail wagged, actually wagged with enthusiasm, and he did it again. Nosed the ball back to me like we'd been playing this game his entire life. We played for 20 minutes, my laughter filling the house in a way it hadn't been filled since Cooper died, and Oliver's tail never stopped moving. A week later, I took Oliver to Riverside Park. It was a Saturday morning, cool and clear, the kind of autumn day that made you grateful to be alive and outside. I took a seat on our usual bench, the one near the duck pond where Cooper and I used to sit and watch the water, and Oliver settled beside me with his customary calm. A young couple walked past pushing a stroller, their toddler clutching an ice cream cone that was melting faster than she could eat it. She stumbled on the uneven path, and the cone tumbled from her small hands, hitting the grass with a soft splat. The little girl's face crumpled immediately, tears welling up as she stared at the ruined treat. Before I could even process what was happening, Oliver stood up, walked over to the crying child with his measured pace, sat down directly in front of her, and began carefully licking the ice cream off the grass. The little girl stopped crying mid-sob, her eyes wide with surprise and delight. "Oh my goodness," the mother said, laughing softly. "He's got such good manners." I nodded, feeling a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the sunshine. "He's got a good heart." That night, as Oliver settled into his bed and I settled into mine, I reached down and touched the brass tag hanging from his collar. My fingers traced the worn engraving. Asterisk if you're reading this. I was loved once. Asterisk. You still are, I whispered. Every single day, you're still loved. Oliver rested his head on my foot, his breathing slowing into sleep, and I didn't move for a long time. The next morning, I called the shelter. The same woman who'd been there when I adopted Oliver answered. "I want to cover the adoption fees for the next 3 senior dogs you get in," I said without preamble. There was a pause on the other end of the line. That's incredibly generous. Can I ask why?" "Because of Oliver," I said simply. "Because someone loved him enough to leave that message on his tag. Because he found his way to me when I needed him most. And now it's my turn to make sure other dogs like him get the same chance." She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, Her voice was thick with emotion. "We just got a 12-year-old beagle in yesterday. No tag, no name, no one's come looking. You think someone like you will come for him too?" "I hope so," I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. "I really, really hope so." That night, as I sat on the porch with Oliver by my side, I looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Oliver was snoring gently, one paw twitching in his sleep with whatever dream occupied his mind. I reached down and ran my hand through his fur, feeling the old brass tag between my fingers. Loved once, now loved again. And that, I realized, was just a beginning. Reggie barked. Not a big bark. Not even a real one, really. More like a muffled woof that surprised even him. He looked at me afterward with an expression that could only be described as shocked, like he'd accidentally knocked something valuable off a table and wasn't sure if he was in trouble. "You've got a voice," I said, setting down my coffee mug with more enthusiasm than the moment probably warranted. My heart was racing with something like pride. "Took you long enough." His ears twitched forward and back, processing this new information about himself. It had been just over a month since I'd brought him home from the shelter. The heavy silence that had hung around him like an old coat had started to loosen, thread by thread. He made noises now. Soft grunts when he lowered himself onto his bed, little puffs of breath when he watched squirrels terrorize the bird feeder from his spot on the porch, and today, his first real attempt at a bark. I knelt down and scratched under his chin, feeling the softness there that the bath had revealed. "You're figuring it out, hey? Finding the pieces of yourself again." He licked my wrist with gentle precision and wandered to the window, one paw resting on the sill, his tail doing that slow sway that meant he was content. The neighborhood outside was quiet in the way autumn mornings get, with leftover leaves lined along the curbs and frost that hadn't quite melted from the shaded spots. I watched as his tail continued its measured rhythm, and I realized with sudden clarity that I'd stopped thinking of him as a temporary presence. We had our routines now, Oliver and I, morning walks to check the mail, slow afternoon strolls around the cul-de-sac, where he'd stop to investigate every interesting smell with the dedication of a detective. Evening couch time where he'd sprawl beside me while I watched documentaries. Or maybe he just liked the sound of my voice when I muttered commentary at the screen. And once a week, always on Saturday mornings, we drove to Riverside Park. That's where we were headed now. "Come on, old man," I said, grabbing his leash from the hook by the door. "Let's go see what adventures await." He trotted over with something approaching enthusiasm, a little bounce in his step that hadn't been there in those early days. I clipped the leash to his collar, my fingers brushing against the brass tag that I'd taken to touching for luck, and he was already at the door before I finished fastening the clip. The truck ride was quiet as usual, though I'd taken to narrating our route to him. "That's the bakery where Mrs. Chen makes those dog biscuits you pretend not to love," I'd say. "Or there's the corner where you found that pizza crust last week and looked so proud." He listened. He always listened. At Riverside Park, Oliver walked like he owned the place. Not with arrogance, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where they belonged. He sniffed every bush like a landlord checking on properties, acknowledged other dogs with dignified nods that suggested he knew them from some past life. Most of them ignored him. A few barked from a distance, warning him off their territory. One small white poodle mix tried to run up to him with puppy enthusiasm, but Oliver gave a short, low growl, not threatening, just a clear communication that he wasn't interested in games. "He's got boundaries," I explained to the owner, a man in his 60s wearing a thick flannel coat and a knowing smile. "That's rare," the man replied. "Most dogs his age get too soft, let everything slide." Oliver led me to the same bench we always stopped at, near the pond where ducks huddled on what remained of the thin ice, their reflections wobbling beneath them. He didn't sit yet, just stood there, staring at the water with an intensity that made me wonder what memories lived behind that golden eye. "You used to come here, didn't you?" I asked softly, though I knew he couldn't answer. "Before the shelter, before everything went wrong, someone brought you here." It was just a hunch, really, but something about the way he moved through this pack, with such certainty, such lack of hesitation, suggested familiarity. He knew these paths, knew where each one led. I tried to picture him younger, with more energy in his legs, fewer scars on his nose and soul. Maybe there'd been a little boy running beside him, throwing tennis balls, or an old man taking slow walks at sunset, or both, A whole family that had loved him and somehow lost him. That tag. Someone had loved him deeply enough to engrave those words permanently, to give him a voice when he had none. "I'm right here," I said, mostly to myself. "Wherever you came from, whoever you were before, you're safe now." On the way home, I stopped by Morrison's Hardware, the kind of place with creaky wooden floors and hand-painted signs that had been there since before I was born. I needed some brackets to fix the loose porch steps that had been wobbling for weeks. "Stay," I told Oliver, cracking the window enough for fresh air but not enough for escape. "I'll just be a minute." He stayed. Didn't bark, didn't whine. Just settled into the passenger seat and waited with the patience of someone who'd learned that good things come to those who don't demand them. Inside, the clerk recognized me immediately. "You're the guy with the shaggy dog, right?" she asked, ringing up my brackets. "That's me," I admitted, slightly embarrassed by my apparent local fame. She leaned forward, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "My niece volunteers at the shelter. She said you saved his life." I shrugged, uncomfortable with the hero worship. "He saved mine too. Probably more than I saved his." She smiled at that, the kind of smile that said she understood more than I'd actually told her. "You should come to the community event this Saturday. It's at the rec center near the park. Seniors are bringing their adopted dogs for a little meetup, nothing big, just folding chairs and bad coffee and people who get it." "He doesn't really like crowds," I said automatically, my protective instincts kicking in. "Neither do most of the dogs," she countered. "That's kind of the point. It's a safe space for the ones who need things quiet." Oliver was sitting taller when I got back to the truck, watching the hardware store door like he'd been keeping track of time. "We've got an invite, buddy," I said, starting the engine. "Community thing on Saturday. You feel like being social?" He sneezed, his version of commentary. "I'll take that as a maybe." At home, I noticed the silence again, but it had changed from those early days. It wasn't heavy anymore, wasn't oppressive. It was comfortable, like a pause in a story where you know something good is coming next. Friday night, I gave Oliver another bath. This time he tolerated it better. Maybe because he'd learned I was gentle. Maybe because he recognized that the end result was worth the temporary discomfort. I brushed him until his coat shone with a golden luster I hadn't seen before, until he looked more like a distinguished gentleman and less like a walking tumbleweed. His coat had grown softer in the weeks since I brought him home. The patchy spots were filling in with new growth. He still had that one cloudy eye, but the other one gleamed with something that looked suspiciously like contentment. "You ready for Saturday?" I asked as I worked a particularly stubborn tangle out of his ear fay. He licked his paw and ignored me, which I'd come to recognize as his way of saying he'd tolerate whatever I had planned. Saturday morning arrived with frost on the windows and the distinctive sound of salt trucks rumbling through the neighborhood, preparing streets for the winter that was definitely coming. I packed a thermos of coffee and grabbed the old blanket I kept for outdoor events. Oliver climbed into the truck like it was just another day. No nerves, no excitement, just his usual steady presence. The event was set up at the edge of Riverside Park, near the rec center building. About a dozen people stood around in winter coats and scarves, holding leashes or tossing tennis balls in slow, gentle arcs. Every dog there moved like Oliver, slowly, carefully, with the distinctive gait of age. A few limped. One rolled along in a custom doggy wheelchair, his tail wagging despite whatever injury or illness had taken his back legs. Another had the grayed muzzle and cloudy eyes that spoke of time won rather than youth lost. I spotted the flannel coat from our previous park visits. The man waved, his smile genuine. "Glad you came," he said, walking over. "What's his name again? I always forget." "Oliver." "Right, Oliver. He looks better. Filled out some. Got that shine to his coat." We stood together making small talk about the weather and the park and nothing important, while Oliver sat quietly beside me, observing the other senior dogs with calm interest. He didn't approach anyone, didn't try to play, but he didn't retreat either. He just existed in the space with quiet dignity. One of the organizers, a woman with kind eyes and a clipboard, approached with a Polaroid camera. "Mind if we take a picture for the board?" she asked, gesturing to a large corkboard set up near the entrance. "We're starting a wall of second chances." I looked down at Oliver. "Smile, old man." He didn't, of course, but he looked at the camera with that curious head tilt, and somehow that was better than any smile could have been. The organizer shook the developing photo, wrote our names on the bottom in neat print, and clipped it to the board under a sign that read, "Found each other." We didn't stay long. After about half an hour, Oliver gave me a look that clearly communicated we're done here and I'd learned to trust his instincts about these things. On the way home, we stopped at the corner convenience store. I let Oliver pick a toy from the little rotating rack by the counter, a collection of cheap plush animals and squeaky things that no self-respecting dog toy company would put their name on. He sniffed a rubber chicken with surprising seriousness, investigated a plush squirrel, finally settled on a stuffed yellow star with a smiley face embroidered on it. I had no idea why, but he held it gently in his mouth all the way to the truck, carrying it like it was made of spun glass. That night, he lay on the rug in front of the TV, chewing the star slowly, not with the destructive enthusiasm younger dogs showed, but with something that looked like savoring, like he wanted to make this toy last, to preserve it as long as possible. I poured myself a drink and sat down on the floor beside him, my back against the couch. "You know," I said, watching him wag methodically at the star-stitched smile, "you could have ended up anywhere. Any kennel, any shelter, any person. And somehow, through whatever twist of fate or luck or divine intervention, here we are." He paused in his chewing, looked up at me with that golden eye, and dropped the toy. Then, for the first time since I brought him home, he did something completely unexpected. He rested his head in my lap. Not beside me. Not near me. In my lap, his skull heavy and warm against my thighs, his breathing slowing as he settled into the contact. I sat absolutely still, not wanting to ruin the moment, barely breathing myself. One hand found its way to the soft fur behind his ears, stroking gently, and we stayed like that until the ice in my glass had melted to nothing and the TV had cycled through 3 episodes of whatever documentary I'd forgotten I was watching. Sunday morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Too early, really, with that restless energy that comes from sleeping but not resting. Oliver was still asleep in Cooper's bed, curled so tightly he looked half his actual size. I made coffee as quietly as I could and sat with the Polaroid from the community event, now clipped to my fridge with a bone-shaped magnet Emma had given me years ago. I stared at our faces in the photo, my tentative smile, Oliver's dignified stillness, both of us looking more comfortable together than either of us had any right to be after such a short time. Something about that photo made me think about the brass tag again, about the person who'd loved Oliver enough to engrave that message, about what story had brought him from loved once to Kennel 12. I made a decision that felt either brave or stupid. I wasn't sure which. Later that morning, after Oliver had eaten his breakfast and completed his methodical patrol of the backyard, I called the shelter. "Hi," I said when the director answered. "This is about Oliver, the dog I adopted about 5 weeks ago. Do you still have his intake records? I know there wasn't much, but I was wondering if I could see them." "Let me check," she said. I heard papers shuffling, keyboard clicking. "Yeah, we've got the basic intake form. Not much there except what was on his tag." "The tag," I said, my heart beating faster. "Can I see the whole tag? I mean, did anyone check the back?" There was a pause. "The back?" I only read the front, the message about being loved, but there might be more. More shuffling. "Hey, we never checked. Hold on." The wait felt eternal. I could hear her moving things around, probably going through the bin of belongings that didn't get sent home with adopted animals. "Well, I'll be damned," she said finally. "There's an address. It's nearly worn smooth, scratched and faded, but it's legible if you hold it in the right light." She read it to me. I scribbled it on the notepad by the phone, my handwriting barely legible in my rush. It wasn't far, maybe 20 miles. Not across the country, not in another state. Just a short drive west through smaller roads and past the edge of town. I looked at Oliver, who had lifted his head from his bed to watch me with patient curiosity. "We're going on a road trip tomorrow, buddy," I said, even though he probably had no idea what that meant. "We're going to see where you came from." He laid his head back down, but his ear remained cocked in my direction. The next morning dawned cold and clear. I made sure Oliver had eaten, packed some water and treats, and loaded him into the truck with more nervousness than I'd felt about anything in years. What if whoever lived at that address didn't want to see him? What if they'd given him up on purpose, dumped him at the shelter in the middle of the night because they couldn't handle him anymore? What if this trip opened wounds that were better left alone? But I had to know. For Oliver's sake, and maybe for my own. The drive took us west through roads that got progressively smaller and less maintained, past farms and forests and the occasional house set so far back from the road you could barely see it. The address led to a farmhouse, not run down exactly, but not pristine either. It was a house that had been lived in hard and loved well, with that comfortable warm quality that comes from decades of use. A man stepped onto the porch as we pulled into the driveway. He was in his 70s, leaning heavily on a cane, with deep furrows between his eyes that spoke of years of worry or pain or both. "Can I help you?" he called out, his voice carrying suspicion and curiosity in equal measure. I got out slowly, my hands visible, trying to project non-threatening energy. "Sorry to bother you, say. I adopted a dog a few weeks back, and I found your address on his old tag. I wanted you to know he's okay." The man's face didn't change at first. He stayed where he was on the porch, gripping his cane. "He's got one cloudy eye," I continued. "Shaggy coat, golden and white. Answers to Oliver, though I'm guessing that wasn't his original name." Something shifted in the old man's expression. "Tucker," he said quietly. "His name was Tucker." I opened the truck door. Oliver, Tucker, had been sitting alert in the passenger seat, and when the door opened, he stepped out carefully. The old man moved forward then, faster than seemed safe for someone with a cane, nearly stumbling down the porch steps. "Tucker," he said again, and the dog's ears shot forward. Oliver, Tucker, walked up to the man slowly, sniffed his shoes and then his hands, and then leaned heavily against the old man's leg. The man dropped his cane. He didn't fall, just lowered himself to his knees with hands shaking, both of them disappearing into Tucker's fur, his shoulders beginning to shake with silent sobs. I stood back, giving them space, my own eyes burning with tears I was too stubborn to shed. "He was my son's dog," the old man said finally, his voice muffled by fur and emotion. "My boy died 4 years ago. Car accident. Sudden. I tried to take care of Tucker after. I really tried. But I wasn't right. Wasn't myself. And one day Tucker just ran off. I figured he couldn't handle being around me either. Figured he was gone for good." He pulled back, looking into Tucker's face with wonder and grief and love all mixed together. "You called him Oliver?" I nodded. "That's what his tag said at the shelter." "Doesn't matter," the man said, his voice firmer now. "He knows you now. That's what matters. He chose you." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said the only truth I had. He saved me too. I was in a dark place, and he pulled me out of it. The old man looked at me for the first time, really looked, and I saw recognition in his eyes. The recognition of one broken person seeing another who'd found a way to start healing. We talked for a while. He showed me pictures, Tucker as a puppy, Tucker with his son, a young man in his 20s with his father's eyes and his mother's smile, Tucker at this very farmhouse living a life I could barely imagine. Before I left, he gave me an envelope. "Open it when you get home," he said. "It's for you." Oliver, Tucker, whatever his name was. He looked between us as we stood there, his tail wagging slowly, seeming to understand that this was closure for all of us. On the drive home, the dog curled up in his usual spot and fell asleep with a depth I hadn't seen before, like he'd been carrying something heavy and had finally set it down. At home, I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, handwritten in careful script, from a man who'd lost too much and was trying to make peace with it. He talked about his son, about how they used to go to the park, about how Tucker would wait by the front door every evening at 5 p.m. with his tail wagging, no matter the weather. Asterisk, when I lost my son, I couldn't handle losing the dog too, asterisk, he wrote. Asterisk, I made a mistake letting him go. You gave him what I couldn't, a second chance to be loved without the weight of all that grief. Thank you for letting an old dog believe again. Asterisk. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box with the Polaroid picture and Oliver's intake papers. That night, I found him not in his usual bed, but curled up outside my bedroom door. Maybe it was the letter, or the memory of his first family, or just the way the wind moved through the trees outside. But I felt something shift in my chest. Not closure, exactly. More like peace. And in the morning, I did something I'd been thinking about for days. I opened my email, found the draft I'd saved weeks ago, and hit submit. Oliver's second act was about to begin. The email confirmation arrived 3 days later. Thank you for your interest in our therapy dog certification program. Your application for Oliver has been received and approved for orientation. Please join us Saturday, November 12th at 9 a.m. at the Riverside Community Center. I read it aloud to Oliver, who was sprawled on the rug by the fireplace, his new yellow star toy tucked between his paws like a treasure. You're going to be official, I told him. A real therapy dog with a vest and everything. He opened one eye, the cloudy one, and closed it again, unimpressed with my excitement. The wind was still carrying winter's breath when Oliver and I showed up for orientation. The community center was tucked between the post office and an insurance agency, in a part of town that felt too quiet for a Saturday morning. Oliver stepped out of the truck with more confidence than I'd expected, his nose already working overtime as we approached the building, cataloging every scent like he was preparing for an exam. Inside, warmth hit us like a thick blanket. Folding chairs lined the walls, a coffee urn hissed in the corner, and half a dozen dogs lay at their owner's feet, each one older, grayer, calmer than any puppy playgroup I'd ever seen. Oliver walked through like he was visiting old friends he'd simply forgotten about. He paused briefly to sniff an elderly pug who gave him a half-hearted tail wag, acknowledged our arthritic German shepherd with a dignified nod, and completely ignored an anxious-looking terrier who clearly wanted nothing to do with anyone. A woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and bright red glasses approached us with a clipboard and the kind of smile that reaches the eyes. "You must be Oliver," she said warmly, kneeling to his level with practiced ease. I couldn't help but smile. "I guess I'm just the chauffeur." She laughed, the sound genuine and kind. "I'm Patricia Chen, program coordinator. We'll keep things informal today. Just want to see how he interacts, how he handles different stimulation levels. You'll do great." Oliver sat beside me, his posture calm but alert, that one good eye taking in everything with quiet assessment. When someone knocked over a stack of handouts and papers scattered across the tile floor with a sound like breaking glass, Oliver didn't even flinch. Just watched the papers flutter and settle, as if to say, "Is that all you've got?" For the next hour, we worked our way through stations set up around the room, each one designed to test a dog's temperament, their ability to remain calm under stress, their suitability for working with vulnerable populations. Station 1 had a vacuum cleaner running at low volume, the kind of sound that sent most dogs into hiding. Oliver walked past it without even a glance, like it was beneath his notice. Station 2 had a child-sized doll seated in a wheelchair, and volunteers were supposed to simulate conversation and gentle petting. Oliver approached the wheelchair slowly, sat down with careful deliberation, and rested his chin on the doll's footrest. His eyes closed halfway, his breathing slowed, and he looked for all the world like he was providing comfort to someone who desperately needed it. "He's got a gift," Patricia said, appearing at my shoulder. Her voice was soft with something like awe. "You didn't train him to do this." "Nope," I admitted. "He trained me." At the end of orientation, we were given a pamphlet printed on cheerful yellow paper and a list of local places that welcome therapy dog visits, nursing homes, libraries, hospitals, support groups, schools. The possibilities stretched out before us like an open road. I thanked the staff and led Oliver back to the truck, my mind already racing with plans and schedules and the terrifying, exhilarating prospect of Oliver helping others the way he'd helped me. "Guess you're officially semi-retired," I said as he jumped into the passenger seat with surprising agility. "Time to give back, hey?" He barked once, not loud, but clear and purposeful. His way of saying "let's get to work." Our first official visit was scheduled for the following Thursday at the Riverside Public Library. They ran a reading program for children with anxiety, speech delays, or learning differences, kids who found reading aloud to adults terrifying but who might feel safer with a dog who wouldn't judge their mistakes. Oliver had never been around groups of children before. There'd been the little girl with the ice cream. Yes, but that was one child, one moment. This would be different, more overwhelming, more unpredictable. But something told me he could handle it. That morning, I brushed him until his coat caught the light like spun gold. I'd given him a bath the night before. He tolerated it with his usual stoic patience, and now he looked more like a show dog than a shelter rescue. I attached the soft blue vest they'd given us at orientation. White letters proclaimed, "Therapy Dog in Training." At the library, we were directed to a colorful corner of the children's section. Bean bags in bright primary colors were scattered across an alphabet-patterned rug. Shelves overflowing with picture books created cozy alcoves. String lights hung from the ceiling like captured stars. A boy named Henry was our first reader. He was maybe 7 years old, with a mop of dark curls and thick glasses that kept sliding down his nose. The book trembled in his small hands as he sat cross-legged on a blue bean bag. Oliver lay down without being asked, his head coming to rest near Henry's shoes, his tail giving a gentle flick every now and then. Henry glanced at him, then at the book, then back at Oliver. He stuttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Oliver blinked slowly. Patient. Present. Henry looked at me, uncertain. I stayed silent, having learned that sometimes the best thing you can do is get out of the way and let connection happen. The boy read slowly, stumbling over words like although and mysterious, his confidence building sentence by sentence. Oliver didn't move except for the occasional twitch when Henry's voice rose with excitement or dropped with uncertainty. By the end of the session, Henry had read 5 full pages without a single adult correction, without anyone telling him to slow down or sound it out or try again. He closed the book with care and looked at Oliver with wonder. I think he listened, Henry said, as if this was the greatest gift anyone had ever given him. I know he did, I replied. Each week after that, we returned. Different kids, different books, but always the same quiet presence from Oliver. He didn't do tricks, didn't fetch or roll over or beg for treats. He just stayed, steady and unwavering, an anchor in whatever storm the children were weathering. Word began to spread. One day, a newspaper photographer showed up and asked if he could take pictures for a feature on local volunteer programs. I said yes, as long as the flash stayed off. Oliver didn't need that kind of stress, and the kids didn't either. The next morning, Oliver's face was on the front page of the local living section. The headline read, "Old Dog, New Tricks. How One Senior Rescue is Changing Young Lives." The mailman laughed when he handed me the paper. "You're much famous now." I framed the article. Oliver sniffed it once, utterly unimpressed, and returned to his more important work of napping in the sunbeam by the window. We added Maple Pine Senior Living to our weekly rotation. Wednesdays at 2 p.m., every week without fail. Oliver would walk through the common area like a mayor making his rounds, accepting gentle pets from trembling hands, offering his head to stroke for those who couldn't lean down, sitting patiently beside wheelchairs while residents told him stories about dogs they'd loved and lost. But there was one resident Oliver always stopped for. His name was Frank Morrison. He sat near the window that overlooked the garden, in the same chair every single day, and in all the weeks we'd been visiting, I'd never heard him speak a word. The staff said he'd been like that for months. Silent, withdrawn, present but not really there. Oliver would walk directly to Frank's chair, sit down beside him without ceremony, and lean his weight against the old man's leg. Then he'd stay there, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for the entire hour, just being present while Frank stared out the window at whatever ghosts occupied his vision. One Wednesday, as we were preparing to leave, I heard it. Quiet, rough from disuse, but unmistakable. "Thanks." I turned. Frank was looking down at Oliver, one weathered hand resting on the dog's head. "You're welcome," I said softly, though I wasn't sure if he was talking to me or to Oliver. The next week, Frank spoke 3 words, "Good to see you." The week after that, he told us about his wife Margaret, who'd passed the previous spring after 62 years of marriage. How she'd loved dogs but they'd never been able to have one because of his allergies. "She would have liked this one," Frank said, his fingers gentle in Oliver's fur. "A nurse pulled me aside as we were leaving. He hasn't let anyone sit near him in months," she whispered, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Whatever you're doing, please keep doing it." We started Fridays at the Downtown Veteran Resource Center. This was new territory, and I wasn't sure how Oliver would handle it. The center smelled like coffee and old leather. A few men sat in recliners, nodding off in front of a muted television. One guy with a beard down to his chest played solitaire at a corner table, his hand steady despite whatever battles still raged in his mind. A man named Marcus Rodriguez met us at the door. He had a deep voice and a pronounced limp, and he wore his fatigue jacket like a second skin, something he couldn't quite shed no matter how long the war had been over. "So you're the famous Oliver," he said, kneeling slower than he probably wanted to. Oliver met him halfway, nose against knuckles, that gentle exploration that had become his greeting. Marcus looked up at me, his dark eyes holding ghosts I recognized. "He always this calm?" "Pretty much," I said. "Good. Marcus replied, pushing himself back to his feet with a grimace. Some of the guys in here haven't had calm in a long time. When Oliver approached the man playing solitaire, the veteran looked up but didn't speak. Oliver simply sat beside the table, his presence a quiet offer. After a few minutes, the man spoke without looking away from his cards. "You here to listen or judge?" Oliver blinked. "Good," the man said. "Me too." By the time we left that first day, the staff had already asked when we'd be back. "Every Friday," I promised, "until someone tells us to stop." Oliver wagged once, as if confirming the contract. Back home, the garden needed tending despite the approaching winter. I spent most of Saturday afternoon pulling the last of the dead plants, preparing the soil for its long sleep, while Oliver lay in what remained of the warm sunshine, watching like a supervisor who'd earned retirement. A neighbor kid wandered over, Lucas, who'd just finished his freshman year of college and was home for Thanksgiving break. He looked lost in that way young people do when they are caught between who they were and who they are becoming. "You mind if I pet him?" Lucas asked, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. "Not at all," I said, peeling off my gardening gloves. "Just go slow and let him sniff you first." Lucas crouched beside Oliver, who lifted his head and gave a lazy sniff of assessment before deciding the kid was acceptable. "He doesn't even flinch," Lucas marveled, running his hand along Oliver's back. "He doesn't see much point in wasting energy on fear," I replied. Lucas laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I wish I could be that calm. Colleges, it's a lot. I'm not even sure what I want to major in anymore. My parents have all these expectations, and He stopped, looking embarrassed. Oliver didn't move, but his presence seemed to settle something in the space between us. Like it was safe to admit you didn't have it all figured out. They sat together for a while, Lucas talking about finals and career paths and the pressure of other people's dreams, while Oliver listened with the same patient attention he gave everyone. After Lucas left, I sat on the back steps and looked at Oliver. "You're some kind of magnet," I said. "You just pull the truth out of people." He gave a soft grunt and stretched out across the warm wood, unbothered by his superpower. That Sunday afternoon, I went through some old boxes in the attic. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just sorting through the accumulated debris of a life lived. That's where I found the photo album labeled North Ridge Cabin. Pictures from years ago. Me, my sister Emma, our parents, and Cooper as a young dog bounding through snowbanks like gravity was a suggestion rather than a law. There was one photo of Cooper lying in front of the stone fireplace, tongue lolling out, eyes half closed in that expression of perfect contentment that only dogs seem to master. I carried the album downstairs and showed it to Oliver. "That was Cooper," I said, tapping the page. "My first best friend." Oliver sniffed the photo carefully, then rested his chin on the album like he was paying respects to a dog he'd never met but somehow understood. The next morning, I made a call. "Emma, you think the cabin's still standing?" My sister's voice carried surprise and something like hope. "Last time we checked, yeah." "Why? You thinking about going up there?" "Thinking about taking Oliver. Let him see something new." "That's a bit of a hike," she warned. "You sure he can handle it?" "Only one way to find out." I packed light, some canned soup, blankets, Oliver's travel bed, the essentials. The weather forecast was clear, and the road hadn't washed out in years according to the local hiking forums. We left at dawn, the truck rumbling along back roads that grew progressively narrower and more wild. By noon, we'd reached the trailhead. I parked, clipped Oliver's leash, and pointed up the path that disappeared into pine forest. "Ready to see something new?" He sniffed the air, really breathed it in, and took the lead. The hike was slow. We stopped often, not because Oliver was tired. He seemed to thrive on the fresh air and forest scents, but because my knees weren't what they used to be and pride only carries you so far. But we made it. The cabin was still there, hidden behind years of overgrowth. The wood had faded to weathered gray. The porch sagged in one corner, but the structure held. The door creaked open with the same groan I remembered from childhood. Inside, dust blanketed everything like snow. But the bones were good. The table still stood. The fireplace still drew. The windows still framed the forest in perfect rectangles of wild beauty. Oliver explored every inch with systematic thoroughness. He sniffed under the old table, circled the fireplace with interest, then lay down in the exact spot where Cooper had been in that photograph. The exact spot. I stared at him, wondering if it was coincidence or something else. Some kind of understanding that passed between dogs across the years. I lit a small fire, the wood I'd brought in the truck, dry and ready, and made soup while Oliver watched from his chosen spot. When the soup was ready, I poured it into a mug and settled into the creaky armchair by the window. That night, the stars came out in overwhelming numbers, unbothered by city lights or modern life. I stepped onto the porch with Oliver and looked up at the vast canopy of light. "You've come a long way," I said softly. "From Kennel 12 to here. From forgotten to this." He didn't move, just leaned against my leg with solid warmth. In the morning, we walked down to the creek that ran behind the cabin. Oliver stepped into the water like he'd been doing it his whole life, lapped at the current, then pounced at a floating leaf with sudden puppy enthusiasm I'd never seen before. "You've still got it," I called out, laughing until my sides hurt. He backed, a sharp, surprised sound, and then another, like he'd forgotten he could make noise and was rediscovering the joy of it. We stayed another night, just us, the fire, the woods, and when we came down the mountain 2 days later, something had shifted again. Not in a dramatic way, more like a page turning, a new chapter starting. Back home, I hung the photo of Cooper at the cabin next to the drawing Henry had made of Oliver at the library, a crayon masterpiece that labeled them reading buddies forever. Different dogs, different years, same feeling of love given and received. That week at Maple Pines, Frank was waiting for us with a new cushion. "Thought he might like it," Frank said, holding it out like an offering of great value. Oliver took his usual place beside Frank's chair, the new cushion making him look even more regal. At the library, Henry read 2 full books without stumbling. "Here's my lucky charm," the boy declared with absolute certainty. Oliver wagged once. Friday at the Veteran Center, Marcus told me Oliver should have his own nameplate. "He's not just a dog anymore," Marcus said. "He's a regular. Regulars get names on the wall." So we made one, a small wooden plaque that one of the veterans carved by hand. It read, "Oliver, the listener." We hung it above the chair he always claimed, and I found myself staring at it, wondering what it meant to really listen, to sit quietly in someone else's space and offer nothing but presence. It wasn't easy, but Oliver made it look like breathing, and more people started sitting down beside him, people who didn't talk much, people who hadn't been seen in a long time, and there Oliver sat, always steady, always there, always waiting. By the time July rolled in with its thick air and slow afternoons, Oliver had made himself a fixture in the entire town. I couldn't walk him down any street without someone stopping us, to pet him, thank him, or ask if he remembered their kid from the library or their parent from Maple Pines. He'd look at them the same way every time, with that quiet stillness and one tilted A, as if to say, asterisk, I don't forget the important things. Asterisk. That week, I added a small sign to our porch railing. I'd carved it myself with a pocket knife during a sleepless night. Oliver's rest stop. Below the sign, I hung a tin bucket filled with dog treats and another with bottled water. It wasn't much, just a small offering to the neighborhood. But it didn't take long before neighbors started stopping by with their own dogs. A woman and a son came by one morning with a scruffy terrier named Rufus. She sat on the bottom step while Rufus explored the yard, and Oliver stayed on the porch with his head resting on his paws, eyes barely open but tracking everything. "I think he knows who's here for more than water," she said softly. I nodded. He usually does. She was quiet for a long moment, her hand absently stroking Rufus's head when the terrier returned to his side. "My husband passed last month. Rufus hasn't left my side since, but he's restless. I thought maybe a new place, a new friend." Oliver stood slowly and walked down the steps. Not fast, not slow, just steady and certain. He reached Rufus, sniffed once, and lay down beside the smaller dog. Rufus curled up immediately, like this had always been the plan. "That's his way of saying you're okay," I explained gently. She didn't answer, just wiped her cheek and smiled through tears that needed to fall. The next evolution came from an unexpected source. The elementary school counselor called one Tuesday afternoon. "We're starting a morning check-in program," she explained, "for kids who have trouble transitioning into the school day. We wondered if Oliver might want to be part of it, just sitting in our calm-down corner, being there." I looked at Oliver, who was watching a bird outside the window with focused intensity. "When do you want us?" "Tuesday and Thursday mornings. 7:30. I adjusted my entire schedule. Some things were more important than sleep or routine. Now, every Tuesday and Thursday at 7:30 a.m., we walked through the front doors of Riverside Elementary. Oliver's paws made almost no sound on the linoleum floors, and kids would appear from hallways and classrooms, some stopping to pet him, others just sitting nearby without saying anything at all. A boy named Marcus came in crying one morning, his arms crossed tight, jaw clenched, the whole world against him in the way it can feel when you're 8 years old and everything is too much. Oliver didn't approach. He just lay nearby, his body angled so Marcus didn't feel cornered or pressured. 5 minutes passed in silence. Then Marcus scooted closer. Closer still. Finally, his small hand landed gently on Oliver's back, and the crying stopped. Not because the problem was solved, but because the weight of it could be shared. The counselor told me later that Marcus hadn't let anyone touch him in 3 months. I didn't tell Oliver, but I think he knew. The Oliver wall at home had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. 2 shelves now. One held treasures from maple pines, pour-painted pumpkins from the autumn art class, a small crochet blanket someone had made specifically for him, blue with yellow stars to match his favorite toy, and a poem written by a resident who rarely spoke. The poem read, "Asterisk he sits, he stays, through all our days. A friend who asks for nothing, gives everything. Asterisk." The other shelf overflowed with school treasures, drawings laminated with K, handmade bookmarks, a crumpled origami dog labeled to Oliver, "You make mornings better." I found myself standing in front of that wall more often now. Not to admire, exactly, more to remember. Every item was an echo of a life touched, a moment of grace, a small miracle of connection. At the library, Henry had begun volunteering to help younger kids in the story cycle. He told me, with absolute seriousness, that it was Oliver's idea. "He listens to me," Henry explained with the logic of a 7-year-old. "So now I can listen to them." That night, I looked at Oliver and said, "You're creating echoes, you know that? People learning from you how to be present, how to listen, how to just be." He huffed and curled into his blanket, unimpressed with my philosophical musings. Mid-October brought a call from a woman named Donna Chen who ran a grief support group that met at the community center twice a month. "Someone told me about Oliver," she said. "We don't want him to do anything special. Just be there. Just sit with people who are learning how to keep breathing when someone they love has stopped." We went that Thursday. The room was dim and warm, filled with the quiet murmur of chairs being adjusted and tissues passed between shaking hands. Oliver took a spot near the corner and laid down, his chin resting on his paws. No one rushed to him. The group was too raw, too fragile for enthusiasm. But by the end of the hour, 3 people had sat near him. One rested a hand on his back without saying a word. Another wept silently, shoulders shaking while Oliver stayed perfectly still. A third just sat close, breathing in rhythm with him, learning how to exist in a world that had changed forever. Afterward, Donna touched my arm. "You don't always need a hug to feel held," she said softly. "Oliver proves that every time he shows up." I wrote it down when I got home. Page 53 of the journal I'd been keeping. Oliver doesn't just offer comfort. He offers permission to grieve, to be silent, to exist in pain without having to explain it. That's a gift most humans don't know how to give. At home, Oliver seemed more reflective as autumn deepened. Not tired, exactly, just stiller. He spent more time at the window in the hallway, the one that faced the neighbor's oak tree, watching the leaves turn from green to gold to rust. I once caught him staring at a squirrel for a full 5 minutes without moving. "You making peace with the wildlife now?" I asked. His ear flicked, but he didn't look away from whatever understanding he and the squirrel had reached. Halloween approached, and the neighborhood kids begged to include Oliver in the costume parade. I refused to dress him up. He wouldn't have tolerated a costume, but I tied an orange ribbon around his collar and let him sit on the porch while kids in capes and paper masks took turns saying hello. A boy dressed as a pirate offered him a plastic gold coin with absolute seriousness. Oliver accepted it like it was the greatest treasure he'd ever received. He carried it carefully to his bed, placed it in the center of his yellow star toy, then returned to the porch as if nothing unusual had happened. The next morning, I found the coin in his food bowl. He was sharing it, making sure even inanimate objects felt included. I added it to the journal. Oliver received a gift and gave it back in the way he knew best, by making it part of someone else's comfort. Asterisk. The last week of October brought the first serious frost. I started laying rugs by the doors to keep the cold from creeping in. Oliver found the thickest one and claimed it as his new napping spot. That same week, a letter arrived from the local Humane Society. Inside was an invitation to a ceremony honoring animals and volunteers who'd made significant contributions to the community. Oliver was being given a Community Service Recognition Award. It was mostly symbolic, a certificate, a small gathering, nothing flashy. But they wanted us there. The event was held in the town hall. Folding chairs, cookies on paper plates, cider in plastic cups. Oliver sat beside me as the director spoke about the impact therapy animals had on communities, about healing that couldn't be measured but could be felt. She mentioned Oliver by name twice. When she handed me the certificate, it read, asterisk for offering quiet companionship, healing presence, and hope to those who needed it most. Asterisk. Applause filled the small room. Oliver didn't react except to lean slightly against my leg. But when a little girl came up afterward and wrapped her arms around his neck, he leaned into her like he'd been waiting all day for exactly that hug. On the drive home, clouds gathered heavy and gray. By the time we pulled into the driveway, the season's first snowflakes had started to fall. They landed on Oliver's fur like tiny stars, cold and perfect. He stood there for a moment after I opened the truck door, nose tilted up, taking it in. He didn't shake them off, just stood in that gentle snowfall, breathing in winter's arrival. That night, I lit the fireplace and pulled his blanket closer to the hearth. He curled up on it without being asked, and I sat nearby with a book I wasn't really reading, just watching him sleep and feeling grateful for every ordinary moment. A few days later, we visited Maple Pines. Frank was waiting by the window as always, but today he had 2 mugs of cider, one for me, one empty. Just a habit now, he explained. Margaret always made 2 cups. Even after she passed, I kept making 2. Oliver walked over and nudged Frank's hand, then laid down beside his chair with a sigh of contentment. He looks older, Frank observed gently. He is older, I replied, though the words hurt to say. Still got it, Frank said, his weathered hand gentle on Oliver's head. Still doing the wake. We stayed longer that day than usual. Something told me we should. That weekend, Oliver didn't come to the library. I called ahead and let them know. He wasn't sick, exactly. Just slow. Still eating, still walking, but quieter than quiet. I made him scrambled eggs on Sunday morning and fed him by hand. He licked my fingers gently, thoroughly, then laid his head in my lap. I read aloud from a journal, all the entries about the people he'd touched, the moments he'd created, the love he'd given and received. His tail thumped softly against the floor every few pages. That night, he chose to sleep at the foot of my bed. He hadn't done that in weeks. I left the window cracked open so he could hear the wind and smell the night air. Monday morning, I woke before sunrise. Oliver was still there at the foot of my bed, still warm, but he didn't lift his head when I stared. I sat beside him, my hand on his chest. Still breathing. Slower now, but steady. I'm right here, I whispered. I'm not going anywhere. He opened one eye, the good one, golden and bright even in the dim light. Then the other, both eyes looking at me with recognition and something that felt like gratitude. I stayed with him. Didn't move, didn't speak again. Just sat with my hand on his side, feeling each breath, being present for him the way he'd been present for so many others. The sun came up slowly, casting pale winter light across the bedroom floor. Oliver let out a long breath, then another, and then stillness. Not struggle, not pain, just the gentle cessation of a life well lived and a job well done. I didn't cry right away, just sat there with my hand on his side, letting the moment be what it was, letting him go with the same quiet dignity he'd given everyone else. Eventually, I stood up on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. I wrapped him in his blanket, the one from the porch, the one that smelled like home and sunshine and all our days together. I buried him in the backyard beneath the maple tree where he'd love to sit on summer afternoons. I placed the brass tag at the base of the stone marker, the tag that read, asterisk if you're reading this, I was loved once. Asterisk. Below it, I added a new line carved with my own shaking hands. Asterisk and loved again. And again. And again. Asterisk. That afternoon, I sat on the porch alone but not empty. The wind moved through the bare branches the same way it always had, and I could almost hear the soft click of his paws on the steps, could almost feel his weight against my leg. In the weeks that followed, I still visited the school, the library, Maple Pines. Not every day. Some days were too hard. But some days I needed to see the faces of people Oliver had touched, to remember that his absence didn't erase his impact. People asked about him. Some cried. Some smiled through their tears and told me stories I'd never heard. Moments when Oliver had been there for them in ways I didn't even know about. One day, I received a letter from a young woman I didn't recognize. I'm studying to be a therapist, she wrote. Because of a dog who never asked me to be anything but myself. Oliver taught me that presence is more powerful than words, that listening is more important than solving. He changed my life without ever knowing my name. Another letter came from a teacher at the elementary school. Marcus still visits the calm down corner. He brings a stuffed dog with him now. Says it helps his heart stop shouting. We bought him the stuffed animal, but it was Oliver who taught him that comfort is real and available and doesn't require words. And one day, a little boy approached me at the grocery store. He couldn't have been more than 6, and his mother hovered nervously behind him. "You were with the quiet dog," he said. Not a question but a statement of fact. I was, I confirmed, kneeling to his level. He made me feel like I was already okay, the boy said solemnly. Like I didn't have to try so hard. I felt my throat tighten. He made me feel that way too. That night, I sat at the Oliver wall. I lit a candle. Something I'd never done before but felt right now. I placed a new item on the shelf, a small wooden figure of a dog, carved by Frank before he'd passed away 2 weeks after Oliver. They'd gone together, in a way, both of them having found peace. Then I opened a fresh journal. On page 1, I wrote, Oliver didn't just change lives. He connected them. He showed us that the quietest presence can be the loudest kind of love. That being there is sometimes the only thing that matters. That every soul, no matter how broken, how old, how forgotten, deserves to be seen and loved and remembered. He was loved once, when he was someone else's dog. He was loved again, when he became mine. But more than that, he taught all of us how to love, not with grand gestures or perfect words, but with patience and presence and the simple act of showing up, day after day, for whoever needs you. The wind rustled outside my window, and for a moment, just a fleeting, perfect moment, I could have sworn I heard the softest wag of a tail. The sound of a good dog, still doing his work, still making people feel seen, still creating echoes that would ripple forward through lives he'd touched and lives those people would touch in turn. Oliver was gone, but love like that doesn't end. It just keeps going, passed from heart to heart. An infinite chain of presence and compassion that started with one old dog in Kennel 12 and a brass tag that told the truth. If you're reading this, I was loved once. And now, that love continues. In every child who learned to read without faith. In every veteran who learned to sit with silence. In every grieving soul who learned that being broken doesn't mean being alone. In every person who learned that showing up is enough. Oliver taught us all how to be better humans. And that is a legacy that will never die. Epilogue. 1 year later, I adopted another senior dog. Her name is Bella, and she's 11 years old. She came from the same shelter where I found Oliver, from Kennel 9, with her own brass tag that reads simply, please try. She sleeps in Oliver's bed beneath the maple tree shade in summer, and by the fireplace in winter. We visit the same places, the library, Maple Pines, the school, the veteran center. She's different from Oliver in 1,000 ways. More energetic, more vocal, more obviously eager to please. But she's learning from the echoes he left behind. The kids at the library tell her about Oliver, about how patient he was. Frank's empty chair at Maple Pines has a small plot now. Reserved for therapy dogs and the people who love them. Marcus at the Veteran Center said it best. Oliver showed us what's possible. Now Bella gets to carry it forward. That's how it works. We love them, they teach us, and then we pass it on. Emma visited last weekend. She sat on the porch with me, Bella between us, and looked at the Oliver wall inside through the window. You gave him a good end, she said quietly. He gave me a good middle, I replied. And because of him, I know how to keep going. The journal sits on my bookshelf now, all those pages filled with moments and miracles. Sometimes I read them to Bella. Sometimes I just remember. But mostly, I try to live what Oliver taught me. Show up. Be present. Listen without judgment. Love without condition. And trust that the smallest gestures, a gentle lean, a patient wait, a quiet presence, can change everything. Oliver was loved once. Then he was loved again. And now, through all the lives he touched and all the hearts he opened, he is loved forever. That scraggly, forgotten dog from Kennel 12 with one cloudy eye and a brass tag full of truth became the teacher none of us knew we needed. And somewhere, in whatever comes after, I hope he knows. He was the best dog. Not because he was perfect, but because he was present. And that made all the difference. Asterisk asterisk the end asterisk asterisk. Asterisk for every senior dog still waiting. For every kennel that holds a soul worth saving. For every person who needs to learn that love doesn't require perfection, just presence. Asterisk. Asterisk adopt. Foster. Volunteer. Be the person your dog thinks you are. Asterisk.